Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Your Life Simplified. My name is Jack Giardino, and for today's topic of discussion, we're going to be covering legacy planning and everything that is involved in discussing generational wealth with that next generation. As previously discussed in past episodes, we've discussed estate planning, which is more of the technical side of estate and legacy planning. So making sure we have the correct documents in place and making sure everything is prepared from a legal side. In today's conversation, we're really going to be covering legacy planning and how do we start to have those conversations with that next generation who may inherit the wealth. One piece of really important information or kind of shocking information for me, at least, before we start today's topic of discussion is this fact that we found out there that according to a study from US Trust, 3 out of 4 affluent individuals say their children are not prepared to inherit wealth. And this is why we truly believe that not only is estate planning and the legal side of things truly important, but legacy planning is just as important of a pillar of a comprehensive financial plan as that estate planning component. So for today's topic of discussion, we've brought on Chad Hamilton, who is Senior Vice President within our practice management group. He's also a chartered advisor in philanthropy. Chad, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jack. It's good to be here.
So could you give our listeners just a brief background on your role at Mariner and experience within legacy planning?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I lead the practice management team here at Mariner. And, there's an old saying for entrepreneurs that it's easy to get so caught up working in the business from day to day that you feel like you don't have any time to work on the business. And that's certainly true for wealth advisors in their own businesses and practices working with clients, right? So that's what practice management is here to help with, to provide support to advisors and their teams to better serve clients and ultimately enhance our overall client experience for our firm by doing that. Now, as to the second part of your question, I've worked pretty extensively with multi-generational wealth planning over the last 15 years in working with clients myself. And some of that is tax-oriented and deals with different gifting strategies. But the other part is a lot of what we're talking about today, call it legacy planning, and that can involve financial literacy. So I would have built and facilitated family educational workshops for clients and their children. Other times it's been helping to draft family mission statements or working with families to collaborate on philanthropy or charitable causes. All those things along those lines that I think fall into this broader category of legacy planning.
All very important things. And I'd like to really break this discussion down into kind of 2 main topics. I know when we're working with clients, I like to split legacy planning into kind of 2 conversations or 2 pieces, so to speak. So on one hand of legacy planning, we have the next generation's own personal wealth. So how are we setting up the child or that next generation to control their own personal wealth and start building their own personal wealth and really just educate them back to kind of your point on the financial literacy piece, helping instill good habits in them within their own kind of personal day-to-day finances. And then the other piece of legacy planning, I tend to think of more of the family wealth. So the kind of overarching family wealth and who's going to inherit those funds and do they understand what roles they may play legally, whether it's a trustee or a power of attorney, but as well as just kind of understanding, the wishes of the hierarchy of the family or the individuals passing on the wealth to the next generation. So when we think about educating the next generation, Chad, regarding handling their own personal finances, what topics are important to cover with your children?
I believe strongly in laying a foundation that's comprehensive and goals-based. So it should all start with a financial plan. And from a technical standpoint, planning is easy. It all boils down to a simple choice. You've got immediate gratification on the one hand, spend now, and deferred gratification on the other hand, spend later. The more you choose deferred gratification, the more successful your financial plan will be. Unfortunately, nearly all of us make the wrong choice and choose immediate gratification unless deferred gratification is more compelling, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a book that was written years ago called Start With Why by Simon Sinek. And in it, he says, Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous speech was called I Have a Dream. It was not called I Have a Plan, right? Now, as a certified financial planner for the last 20 years, that stings a little bit, but I think he's right. It's not saying that plans are unimportant. But plans are practical. What they don't do is incentivize us to bring about the changes that are needed, right? They don't instill that kind of motivation. So it's dreams and hopes for the future that really provide the incentive structure needed to follow through on all the things that anyone needs to do to have a successful financial life. So the point in all that is meaningful goal setting is instrumental. It's foundational to any of this conversation. I think that's where it starts. And then with that as a foundation, it's important to address debt and cash flow management, investments 101, and I think insurance is sort of the foundational building blocks.
Mm-hmm. How should parents, approach these conversations with their children? Is it, hey, I think you should listen to this podcast. You'd find it very beneficial. Or, hey, this is what we do or what I've done in the past. Or is it handing them a book and saying, hey, go read this, right? I think there's all different avenues. But in your time and experiences, what have you seen work with the conversation between parents and the next generation?
Right. Well, you actually alluded to it there. You used the word experiences. I think experiences are the most powerful component of that. So anytime that you can get children involved in experiences and actually making choices themselves. So, if you start to think about kids with money and if they earn an allowance and we help them conceptualize so that 3 different buckets that they can put to use that money, whether it's saving, spending, or gifting. And some people will use labeled jars or things along those lines to help kids, especially when they're younger, kind of start to make those decisions and allocate to the different buckets and make choices around, things. I can think conversations with my kids over the years where we'd be in a restaurant and they want a soda and we say, well, sure, you can do that. Or you can have the $2 and drink water instead, and then we can give you the money that you would have otherwise spent for that soda. So there's certain trade-offs that we try to help them learn and make those decisions early. I think beyond kind of the practical instances, I do think there's a lot of value to bringing in a third party, though, for the reasons that you said. Right? It's not mom and dad telling me what to do. There's some gravitas that a third party can have, that they're more receptivity from children a lot of times, no matter how old they are in some cases, seeing someone brought in with some expertise that isn't that familiar face that is in more of an authoritative role in their life, right? So there is a lot of value to that as well.
And, I certainly agree that I believe there's a lot of value added to bringing in that third party, right? And even just sometimes guiding those conversations. I know we've had family meetings before where we bring the whole family together, right? And we talk with both sides maybe beforehand and, hey, parents, what are on your mind? Hey, kids, what are on your mind? And then we bring everyone together and we help guide those conversations. And I think that third party individual, having them at the table to help guide those conversations is truly a game changer.
Thanks again for downloading this episode of Your Life Simplified, which is produced by Mariner Wealth Advisors. And at Mariner Wealth Advisors, we're here to serve as your advocate. We help people chart a course to reach their personal and financial goals so that they can have greater peace of mind that may lead to a more fulfilling life. We do this by always putting our clients first. Because as fiduciaries, we're required to provide guidance that's in the best interest of clients, not in the best interest of a company or shareholders or anyone else. So as you listen to this podcast and have questions about maybe your own financial situation, or would simply like a second opinion, or even you have an idea for a future podcast, please go ahead and email us at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. If you found the information on this podcast valuable, please go ahead and share it with a friend or family member that you think might benefit from this information. And please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and now back to the episode.
Put myself back into kind of my younger days, money was always kind of a taboo topic with my family. I don't think my parents were necessarily trying to hide anything, but it's just not something that was ever talked at the dinner table or really brought up with my siblings and I. So you talk about having these conversations with your children now. when should you start having these conversations with your children? Is it as soon as possible? Is it, wait till they're in high school, wait till they've graduated high school or college and start their first full-time job? When is the right time to start these conversations with your children?
I mean, as with a lot of things, I think the sooner the better, but it's a really nuanced answer, right? Because it depends on what the conversation is about. And I think there are a lot of valid perspectives across the spectrum in terms of how much information you should share with the next generation about your wealth and potentially what they may receive at some point. I think you can make the case on a lot of levels as to how open you want to be. And that might vary from child to child too, depending on their acumen and their ability to handle that kind of information and process it and what that might do to their own incentive structure. But one thing to think about, and I think this is important, is we all know that when we think about estate planning and inheritances, it's a huge source of tension and problems in families and siblings, relationships being torn apart and all those kinds of things. And the vast majority of cases, it's not because of technical planning that was done or wasn't done. It's not so much the logistics of the plan itself, nearly as much as it is attributable to trying to discern the intentions of mom and dad who are no longer around, and no one really knows because there were never really any discussions at that level of saying, hey, everyone, here's what we're trying to achieve. Here's what we would like to see happen with our estate when we're no longer here. And this is what we hope will come about and how we're trying to do that to whatever degree of specificity you want. But those family conversations go a long way to alleviating really bad, and toxic environments down the road in lieu of that kind of conversation being had.
And I think that's a perfect explanation as we kind of move from more of that personal legacy planning for the next generation to more of the family legacy planning for the next generation. And it's a perfect explanation of why to involve the next generation and why to start having those conversations. And to your point, to kind of alleviate some of those different stressors that may come upon post-death for the family. And I think that, we were kind of chatting before we were recording this, and you give a really great breakdown on the three options of family wealth. So how can families begin to involve the next generation? And ultimately, what are the three options for families' wealth? Would you mind just walking kind of through that with our listeners?
Yeah. So if you have excess wealth, more assets than you need personally to support your own lifestyle, then there's really only three options. It can go to the IRS and taxes. It can go to your heirs in the form of an inheritance, or it can go to charity and charitable organizations. And when you start to look at it from that framework, then that creates some interesting and I think really important conversations, because then it's a matter of, I know for a lot of the clients that we work with, they really do want to minimize the amount that's going to the IRS in taxes. And then it's a matter of, okay, so do you want to give as much to your children as you possibly can? And some people will say yes. And others will say, no, I'm more of the Warren Buffett mindset, where the goal is to give my kids enough that they can do anything, but not so much that they can do nothing, if that makes sense, right? So we don't want to disincentivize them or create an entitlement mentality is the concern on that side. So depending on your perspective, it may be for some families that even if the charitable piece wasn't a big thought initially, as they start to think this through, they end up with more intentions around the charitable planning side because of that framework, right? Because they don't necessarily like everything to go in one or two of the other buckets. So just trying to think through it. And again, there's not a right answer, but the important thing is if you have time and time's on your side, then you can have a lot of impact and control over how much goes to each of those buckets. So if with the intentionality, the time and the ability to incorporate a lot of different strategies in there, you can have a huge impact on how you skew the distributions to heirs, charity, or taxes.
There's two pieces that I kind of want to latch onto that you just discussed. And the first one is there is no right answer. Each family is going to be different. Families are going to have different goals and different mindsets when it comes to their family wealth. And the second piece is the charity piece. I've seen this personally with working with clients. Is we were discussing earlier that when's the right time to start having conversations with your children. And some families may be more open to have these conversations regarding their whole family wealth. Some families may not feel as comfortable having those conversations. And back to the point, there is no right answer. It just depends what you're comfortable with doing. And I've seen charity play a huge role with starting to have those conversations because these funds may be allocated towards charity. And it's kind of removes that personal wealth side of things from the conversation where the next generation tend to see those funds as more of, hey, this is kind of a charitable bucket. I don't know what else is going on in my folks' life financially, but here's the amount that's allocated towards charities and here's why they donate to these certain charities. And it kind of just, it's a smooth transition to start having those conversations with the next generation. Just kind of a personal experience that I've seen, working with clients here at Mariner. And I truly enjoy the charity side of things as well.
I completely agree. I would say that charitable planning is probably the single most effective means of teaching stewardship I've seen. And when you have a pool of money earmarked for charitable giving, whether it's formally designated in a family foundation, a donor advised fund, charitable trust, or it's just an account, right? That's informally earmarked for giving the money away. It's great to be able to tell a child, and they could be 8 years old or 28 years old, but to say they have the ability to recommend gifting a portion of those funds to a specific cause or organization, then ask them to do research and present their idea to the family. I mean, I think that there's several advantages to that. One is it teaches them important business skills to be able to do research and make a persuasive case for whatever they want to do and whoever they want to give to. And it also teaches them stewardship skills to be able to wisely determine how best to utilize family resources. And lastly, I do think it can pull families together when they think about what good can we do with this money that we have, these resources that we have, and what causes do we want to support with that. So I'm fully with you, Jack, in terms of the upside of that charitable planning piece.
And I would relate that too to maybe the overall investment portfolio piece too. We've seen several families that we've worked with where, their children are younger, maybe they're just graduating college or just kind of getting on their 2 feet, and they don't have a lot of funds to invest, but they want to start that conversation with their children. So they'll walk through, or maybe they'll allocate, 5% of our overall portfolio. We're going to let our kids take a role in those funds. So they're going to pitch us, certain stocks or whatever it may be. And it's kind of fun, having that interaction between the parents and the children and the advisor kind of being the third party into that. I've had a lot of fun with those conversations, but similar to charity, right? It passes on that responsibility to the next generation. Hey, we're giving you this responsibility. How would you like to allocate this small piece of the portfolio? And bring us those reasons. And then to your point, kind of pitch that case to us. And then ultimately, through the advisor and through the head of the family, we all sit down and have a conversation around those different pitches that they're bringing to the table and why we may or may not recommend proceeding with those certain investments. So I've seen it on both sides. I enjoy both. And I think the conversations are always fun and kind of brings the family closer together too, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's that value of firsthand experience, right, that we were talking about, where if they have the ability to invest some money, even if it's a small pool, and they start to get involved in looking at the markets and seeing how their investments have done, and really, it's amazing how much more all of us will learn once we have some skin in the game and once we're really involved at that level, as opposed to when it's more just conceptual and book smarts.
So we've been discussing, financial assets and more of the transfer of wealth and having these conversations with the next generation. But you had sent over a pretty interesting kind of survey that was done, and it discussed, financial assets and property were actually relatively low on the list of what families actually want to pass on to the next generation, with intangible assets kind of being that higher higher number one more important thing to pass along. Would you mind just kind of discussing that a little bit? And I think this is super unique and kind of clears things up for most folks. And I think they would tend to agree on that.
Sure. There's an organization called Allianz, and they have done research with affluent individuals over a course of many years. And their studies have been consistent, remarkably consistent. When they ask people, one of the questions is, what's most important to you to pass on to subsequent generations? Mm-hmm. And they're given a list of choices. And very consistently, the choices that rank the lowest are things like financial assets, personal property, real estate, investment accounts, bank accounts. At the top of the list are intangible assets like family stories, life lessons, values. Those are the things that people say are most important to pass on to subsequent generations. And that's true for different age groups, for baby boomers and for the older generation above. So it wasn't just one subset, it was consistent. And I think it begs the question, when there's so much emphasis, it's always placed from an estate planning perspective. I mean, it's generally, that's what we're talking about is financial assets. And those are important, right? I'm not saying it's not important, but it does beg the question, what are we doing to address the intangible assets and how those are passed on? Or is there even a conversation around that? The vast majority of businesses do have some kind of mission statement and core values, and they post that, and that's important. It's important for hiring people. It's important for customers to understand this is what we represent as a company. Do families have that? Do in terms of family to be able to say this is our mission statement, our philosophy, something to where if you think about the average estate plan, it documents several inches thick, and it's all about how assets are transitioned from one generation to the next. Is there anything that covers the why? Why are we doing this? What matters? What are we hoping to accomplish?
And I think it's super interesting. I like to think of it, you may think this is ridiculous, but I think of it as cheat codes, not necessarily the stories or memories that we pass down from generation to generation, but more of those lessons and those values. And my parents and your parents, Chad, they've all done something to get to where they are now. And if they can transfer, those lessons and values and ideas and thoughts and everything that they've experienced over that time frame to the next generation, all it's going to do is it's going to propel me so that I don't make those same mistakes or I don't run into those same issues. And I look at it as cheat codes, right? And I'm throwing this out there as a crazy idea, and I've been trying to get it going with my grandma, and she's not really taken on to it, but I've been asking her to just, hey, every day, would you record a story or something that's been on the top of your mind, or a memory from when you and grandpa got married, or whatever it may be, and just every day record a story. And then I'm hoping to have a large list of audio, and then I'll transcribe it to text, and it'll kind of be a book that I put together to pass on to the next generation to just learn from my grandma and hear those stories. And you can even have the audio with it, right, to hear her voice. So I think there's all different unique ideas. And although the estate and the financial assets and the real property and all of that part of it is extremely important, I do think that, focusing on those intangible assets are extremely important as well, too.
Yeah, it's a great example. And I think what you just talked through and those little videos and conversations, capturing those memories, those stories, that wisdom, I think is exact. That's a great way to encapsulate, I think, what that research shows and what a lot of people say. I do want to pass this on. This is super important. It's just then taking the step to think through, well, what does that look like? How can we do that?
And I think from the other side, I would almost, if I was a betting man, I would bet that, it's important to the generation passing it on, but it's also extremely important to the generation that's going to be receiving it. I know if I talked to my siblings, they would all love to hear the stories and wisdom and values of my grandma being passed on to them. So I think both generations find it extremely valuable as well, too.
Absolutely.
Well, Chad, before we end today's episode, is there any last thoughts, ideas, or anything that you wanted to cover regarding legacy planning and having these conversations with the next generation?
Jack, I think it was a pretty comprehensive conversation, so I don't have anything else in particular to add.
Thank you, Chad, for being a guest on today's episode. Truly appreciate you taking the time. And for all of our listeners, if you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, feel free to reach out to podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. Please like, share, and pass this episode on to anyone that you believe would find it valuable. Thank you again for tuning in to today's episode, and I'll see you next time.
Mariner Wealth Advisors, MWA, is an SEC-registered investment advisor with its principal place of business in the state of Kansas. Registration of an investment advisor does not imply a certain level of skill or training. MWA is in compliance with the current notice filing requirements imposed upon registered investment advisors by those states in which MWA maintains clients. MWA may only transact business in those states in which it is notice filed or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from notice filing requirements. Any subsequent direct communication by MWA with a prospective client shall be conducted by a representative that is either registered or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from registration in the state where the prospective client resides. For additional information about MWA, including fees and services, please contact MWA or refer to the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website, www.advisorinfo.sec.gov. Please read the disclosure statement carefully before you invest or send money. The views expressed in this podcast are for educational purposes only and do not take into account any individual personal, financial, legal, or tax considerations. As such, the information contained herein is not intended to be personal legal, investment, or tax advice. Nothing herein should be relied upon as such, and there is no guarantee that any claims made will come to pass. The opinions are based on information and sources of information deemed to be reliable, but Mariner Wealth Advisors does not warrant the accuracy of the information.